Before we get to your questions, as I mentioned, we are very fortunate to have Riley with us again this year. He is the Special Counsel for Amateur Radio Enforcement. As Special Counsel, he deals with many of the enforcement issues and many of the problems that occur in ham radio. I think in a couple of years we're going to give him a degree in psychiatry too. I'm sure that you have a lot of questions for him, and I know that there's always been a great interest in what he's been up to over the years. So Riley, if you're here.
Well, you could have gone to the flea market, but you decided to come to church instead. So I got you now. I want to thank you for coming here to Dayton. Just by your sheer numbers, you make the Hamvention one of the most powerful forces in amateur radio, and it shows you're serious about it and you care about its future. And by participating in an event such as this, you help ensure its future because you show your numbers and you show your determination. I've been talking to you for quite a few years now, and I'm not going to go over enforcement updates. There's no need for me to waste your time with that. You can follow amateur radio enforcement in the publications at CQ, QST, Rain Report, Newsline, and the ARRL website, and now our own FCC enforcement website list enforcement actions that you can go to and track them there. And that's a recent change that the Bureau Chief offered to do, which we were very happy with. I want to talk about what bothers me the most about amateur radio, and I want to give you a homework assignment. First, the blatant rule violations. I think you can see that we're taking care of them, or most of them, on a gradual basis. Your violations are about what we would expect, or the magnitude of violations are about what we would expect from a service this size. What concerns me most is this: you still need to lighten up. And I said this last year. I said this last year, but you need to take it to heart more. All of you have different interests, and all of you can learn from each other. And you need to work together more and show a little more respect for your diverse interests and for the service as a whole. It isn't about you. It isn't about enforcement. It's about amateur radio. Every time you get on the air, you need to decide what's most important to you: the best interest of amateur radio as a whole, or your own pride or your own ego. Now, I realize I may be preaching to the choir here, but on the air, you need to be more cooperative and less argumentative, and I need you to take this message back to you when you go home, to people who didn't get here and who may not understand this. Your assignment, one part of it, is to read Dave Sumner's article in May QST, page 9. I have a couple of hundred copies. There's a box in the back corner here. There's plenty for everybody, and I have some up here. So everybody will have one, just judging on the size of this crowd. But if for some reason you don't get one or you don't have time to pick one up, contact me, and I'll get one to you. Let me read just one little sentence from it. Most of the unpleasantness that erupts from time to time on the most popular HF bands can be avoided if we're willing to be flexible in our frequency selection. That's about all you need to know about amateur radio. Because I have good news and bad news for you. The good news is there's nothing wrong with amateur radio. It's a good service that's showing its value to the public on a day-to-day basis. The bad news is there's an element of amateur radio that too often reflects present society generally, and there's not a lot we can do about that except to hope that the pendulum swings. Whatever the phenomenon is behind road rage, whatever that is, and I'm not going to try to define it, that's what I'm talking about. All of you need to work together more and depend upon the FCC less to solve your operating problems. We've got a few specific messages to different groups. To the nets, it doesn't matter how long you've been on that frequency. All frequencies are shared. A group of 3 or 4 people meeting on the same frequency every night for 75 years, using 1,200 watts when 100 would do just fine. That's not a net, that's a round table. No net on planet Earth is an oasis of amateur radio. The world is not going to end if you vary the frequency or even if you don't meet one night. To the widebanders, if you want to operate a broadcast station, apply for one. Extraordinarily wide signals on crowded spectrum at peak times are rude and inconsiderate and set you back. To the contesters, use a little more courtesy and remember that even when operating split, you don't own a frequency, they all are shared. To those that don't like contesters, lighten up. Contests are short-lived. If they're bothering you, go to the work bands. Wash the car, cut the grass. And learn from the contesters. Some of these contesters are the best radio operators on planet Earth. And the nets need to learn from the contesters on how to get messages through and not take 15 minutes to get a 10-second message with phonetics through. To the repeater owners, you don't own the frequency just because you're coordinated for it. A coordination is only a recommendation. And get your paperwork together. And remember, it's your call sign on the repeater, and nobody asked you to start a repeater. If you shut down the repeater tomorrow, you know what would happen? People would use other repeaters. It's no different than leaving your den door open if that's where your station is. If you let people in and they misuse it, lock the door. Don't ask us to babysit. That's what control operators are for. To the QRPers, thank you, thank you, thank you for your vitality, your inspiration, and your enthusiasm, and for being builders again. I wish I could spread your enthusiasm across all sections of amateur radio. And when I see you folks, the QRPers, I see the excitement and magic of my first contact. And to those of you who don't like QRPers, anyone can use a linear amplifier as a crutch. To those that don't like de-expeditions, if a group of people want to go to the islands or sit on a rock for a week in the ocean, live in tents in 100-degree weather, swat mosquitoes and scorpions, and operate ham equipment, lighten up and let them do it. I can't tell you how many complaints I got about Scarborough Reef all week long. It wasn't even under our jurisdiction. It was chaos for a few days and then it was over. 46,000 contacts and about half of them CW. Nobody would have even known about it if the league hadn't published it. Somebody thought it was important. About 46,000 people thought it was important, but it's over now. And back to your homework. Most of the unpleasantness that erupts from time to time on the most popular HF bands can be avoided if we're willing to be flexible on our frequency selection. Dave Sumner's article. You're calling the FCC too much to solve your problems. To all operators in general, I say this. This is just about a 40-year-old QST article, QST magazine. Next to the last page is a big presentation on SWAN equipment. How many of you remember SWAN transceivers? Boy, they were the latest and greatest, weren't they? The SWAN 500 and the SWAN 50. Well, let's take the 350. It has 12 little knobs and one big knob. So does the 500, and so does the 250. So then take this QST magazine about 40 years later. Let's look on the back. TS 570, it's got 46 little knobs, one big knob. And you look in the last page there, there's the 2000. And I remember last year I heard a guy behind me when I was looking at it saying, That's so big and pretty, I couldn't get that in the house unnoticed. I thought that was a good remark. By the way, if you ever hear that I'm dead, race to Gettysburg to my house, because every piece of equipment in my house cost about $150. You can get some good deals. But this FT2000 has 75 little knobs, but it's still got one big knob right here. There's a reason for that, and there's a reason that you have thousands of frequencies. My pet peeve, too many are like people at a shopping center. You'll argue over a parking space when there are 150 vacant ones. Now, you have to look at it this way. Every city has a bad neighborhood. It's an area that'll just take time and more resources to clean up. Their economic, sociological problems and other things, mental problems, like the ham bands. But if you had 3 alternative streets that you could take to work, and one was through a bad neighborhood, and every time you drove that street, somebody hit your windshield with a rock, wouldn't you take another street after, say, 5 or 6 windshields, 8 or 10 windshields? So who's the bigger idiot, the person throwing the rock or the person that drives down that street every day when they don't have to do it? Well, why don't you take the same approach to the amateur bands? Let's look at 14275. It's a bad neighborhood. Probably in the future, we will find out that there is no problem with RF radiation brain damage at all, except on 14275. They're very poor operators on that frequency. There's a very poor operator in Canada. Canada considers him a fruitcake. Apparently, they're not taking him seriously, and their rules are pretty lax, and they are in amateur enforcement about where we were about 10 years ago. But I get complaints every day from operators who go to 14275 and they get abused. They get on the frequency and they make it worse, because instead of it being a Canadian problem, in a few minutes it becomes an American problem too, because they get into the fray. And I listened to an argument or a discussion the other day on 275, and one of the comments was, well, I'm not going to be driven off this frequency. I got rights. So there again, most of the unpleasantness that erupts from time to time on the most popular HF frequencies can be avoided if we're willing to be flexible. It's an international problem. It's not our jurisdiction. We're talking to Canada, we're working with them, but they're in a different state of mind, and they consider the fellow to be several French fries short of a Happy Meal. And they're not going to put a lot of resources in it, apparently. There's a similar operator in Italy. Use the big knob, go somewhere else. Report the problem. Report the problem, that's part of your self-policing function, but don't become part of it. The world is ugly enough. Don't add to it. You have control over that problem. You can defuse it and refuse to become part of it, and that's the contribution you can make to amateur radio. I asked one participant on 14275 why he always hung out on 14275. And he said, well, and I can't use the name he was referring to because it would reveal the person, but he said, well, old so-and-so likes to talk there and he doesn't have any other antennas. So this must be a very precisely cut antenna not to work anywhere else, even on 20 meters. Remember the saying from the 60s? What if they gave a war and nobody came? How many of you remember that? What if they gave an argument on the ham bands and nobody came? And to be honest with you, too much of society today is rude, self-important, cell phone yapping, road raging, stressed out monsters behind the wheel, or unfortunately, behind the microphone. It's a similar thing. Now that's it in a nutshell. We can't save you from yourselves. The best enforcement program in the world won't do that. The Orientals have a saying about Americans. They say we'll lose butt if it means saving face. And as Dave Sumner again says in this article, there's plenty of room for everyone who wants to operate. Now, when you decline to be part of a problem, you make the greatest contribution to amateur radio. We can enforce the rules, we can enforce kindness, courtesy, or common sense. But as a very wise person named Bill Cross once told me, we can't regulate stupid. We are all ordinary people. We're going to make mistakes. So much of the interference on the amateur bands is absolutely unintentional. The best interference report and solution, I carry this with me everywhere, is I got a complaint. I've listened to it all day. It's a drift net beacon, at least that's what I think it is, on 75 meters. It's S9 here at home, so it's probably up or down the bay. See if you can have somebody do direction finding on it. So that was at 4:57 p.m. At 6:29 p.m., you're going to laugh, I found out it was my Linksys 5-port Ethernet switch in the next room. When I tried to DF it with a selective AM radio, I noticed the signal went silent when I left the house. That was the clue. I started turning off my gear, and it was my switch. Now, exactly, and had this been on 14-275, you would have heard an hour and a half discussion as to who was doing it and why. We're all ordinary people, and we make mistakes, especially with today's equipment. About a week ago, I became convinced that my CW keyer was out. I hadn't been on the air in about a month and a half, and I became convinced that it had gone south. I substituted keyers, I checked all the cables, and finally I remembered that you've got to push the MOX or the VOX button to use this thing on CQ. And I've had this thing for 3 years. I just forgot about it. I hadn't been on in a while. I'm supposed to know this stuff. Our new flat screen was in black and white until I realized I had the cables wrong. And my wife said, "And you work for the FCC." We're all ordinary people. We may think we're special. We may think Americans are special. We're all ordinary people, and we're going to make mistakes. Now, even the public safety services don't have thousands of frequencies that they can use like you do, hundreds of usable ones at any given time. You have those so you can have alternative plans and be fail-safe. That's why you have so many frequencies that aren't channelized. One net, when it has interference problems, says, okay, we're going to frequency B, and they just stay silent for a half hour. Come back on and there's no problem. And whoever is after them, it drives them crazy because they can't find them. It's a good tactic. It's a good tactic, but use your frequencies. Use your frequencies and try the WART bands. They're great. People who haven't been on them just love them. And to those of you who have been continual problems and we haven't gotten to you yet, you have a problem coming up now. Your renewals are coming up. You have the burden of proof. You have to come to a hearing in Washington, D.C. You have to make a case as to why you should keep the license. You have a lot of questions to answer, and the chickens are coming home. And finally, to all of you who will complain about the code being eliminated, I'll say this. If it was such an earth-shaking issue, why did less than 1% of you even file comments on it? Why is it important now, but it wasn't important then? Number two, how can it be a filter if the worst enforcement problems we have are advanced and extra class license? Number three, it wasn't eliminated. It just isn't required. For a driver's test, do you have to know how to operate a 6-speed transmission? I don't think so, but those are some of the coolest cars on the road with the 5- and 6-speed transmissions. The idea of eliminating the code has been floating around for years, yet there is more and more code equipment today than ever before, and you'll see it today. We won't know the effect for 10 years. Now, personally, I work code 90%. I honestly don't see it as a potential enforcement problem. I'm loyal to the code, but my bet is dropping the code requirement will turn out to be, over time, a stroke of genius. We'll know for sure in about 10 years, I won't be here because all these Hamfest hot dogs will have caught up with me by then. So you'll have to go over the mountain on your own. But if we don't do something to appeal to greater numbers, in a few years there won't be enough room out here for all the walkers. We're getting old. We need to try new things and always work towards keeping amateur radio dynamic. You just have to know the issues, participate in it, try to be courteous even when it goes against every grain of your core being, and enjoy it. And I want to thank you again for all the incredible support that you've given our enforcement program. The self-regulating aspect of this service never ceases to amaze me. And in closing, I want to say I've been working for you for 8 years, 7 months, 16 days, 2 hours, and 15 minutes. I can't imagine a better group of licensees to work with, and I've always had interesting jobs at the commission, and I'm one of the few people on planet Earth, I think, who have always just enjoyed my job. But you folks are the best, and I'm so thankful I get to work with you, and I want to thank you for all your passion and all your dedication. Thank you. And be sure,
Kerry brought that to my attention when I was lamenting to him after a DX weekend that there was no way that I could do anything other than listen if I didn't create QRM to somebody else. And you could see going in the back of his head was, this dude's never read the DX Code of Ethics or whatever it's called. And I said, no, I probably haven't. But I talked to people in really short bursts, so therefore it must have been okay. So I was one of those unintentional QRMers, and I began to think about that and ran into this lecture that's exactly 10 years old. It's as pertinent today as it was 10 years ago, in my opinion, and probably will be pertinent 10 years from now. Mike, I know you know Riley from experience. You want to open up kind of the Q&A, because what we want to do, because we just don't want to show a video and you walk home and say, I could have done that video from my own house, or you know, you did get to have some food. We didn't charge you for that food, by the way. But Mike, some personal comments on Riley, and then why don't you kick it off with a question to the group?
Okay, well, we were fortunate to have Riley Hollingsworth as a guest speaker back at Winterfest in 2002, and I think we had him another year as well. He was just like what you saw. And I don't think he titled his talk One Big No, but it was something like that. As a show of hands, could we see how many of you believe you have been deliberately interfered with on the air in the last year? Deliberately on the air. Okay, Ron, what was your example?
Talking to my friend on Wednesday evening, 4:30, somebody just came on and made snide comments without a call sign.
Snide comments,
Yeah.
okay.
We just made believe they weren't.
Okay, Mike?
Running national parks on the air, CW. Huge pile up, and the guys, or I assume it was one guy, continually just saying, thank you, 599, thank you. And it just causing chaos. And apparently, talking with some other operators after the fact, he was hijacked somebody else's call sign, and but he was just sitting on my frequency, and it just ruined it because everybody's trying to contact me, and he was just coming back, thank you, 599, and you know, just caused some chaos. So it was just, you know, be quiet and wait half an hour and just pick it back up again.
Yeah. John?
Yeah, there's a fellow that has a jammer that likes to get up on FM, and during the January VHF UHF contest, he was phenomenally active, and I was able to work around him and through him because he was a little bit closer to DC, but he caused a lot of people heartache, and then he popped up during the VAQSO party. But again, too many frequencies out there, we could just move right around him and through him. But it's annoying. He hits the repeaters too. He goes after Bluemont all the time during the nets. As soon as traffic starts getting past, he'll flip it on and just wipe everybody out.
Okay, thank you.
You don't want you to pick up on this thread.
Well, first, I apologize. I'm not at my best here. I have a cold, and I haven't been at my best for a couple of days. I want to mention in a minute an article written by a friend of mine, but let me just ask you this. Do you think QRM is getting worse, especially intentional QRM? Is it getting worse, better, staying the same? What's going on? Okay, so we have one vote for better. And by better, you mean there's less of it? Okay, we have two votes for it's getting less evident. Any other comments about that? Well, let me just take a second to say, I hope you'll pick up a copy of this article before you leave. It's a copy of an article in CQ magazine 4 years ago written by a fellow named Jim Milner, who's a friend of mine. He's WB2RDM. And Jim is a retired psychologist, very active PM, does the expeditions, that sort of thing. And he runs an informal group in the mornings on 7163. If you're interested, come on by. And he often gets interfered with. That group often gets interfered with. And Jim, being a psychologist, has a couple of very interesting thoughts about it, which he shares in this article. He also mentions Riley Hollingsworth in there. And by the time this article was written, Riley had already retired from the FCC, and it appeared that enforcement was going down. In fact, it wasn't. It was just it wasn't published as much as it had been in the past. All right, so I guess I kind of wonder too. Okay, that's a good question. You mean QRM?
Do they generally advocate to some particular motor van?
Well, there you go. That's a great question. Those of you who have experienced QRM, especially intentional QRM, you find it more frequently on certain bands,
Maybe
or on sideband, CW. How about digital? Doesn't seem to be great.
Used to be really terrible on VHF FM, 2-meter FM.
Yeah, well, and that's what John was talking about, yeah. Okay, and I'll just share a couple of quick personal stories. One of them is, I like to work DX. I have a very modest station. I like to think of my stations as sort of if the big guys are cannons, my station is more like a slingshot. And so for me to work an all-time new one or to work at the expedition is really a big deal for me. And so about 2 weeks ago, I was working this Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, the expedition, Tango Uniform 7 Charlie, I think it was. They work in all those all bands. They did 52,000 contacts in their week or whatever. But I was trying to work those guys, and I get this, and I'm a sideband guy, so the voice, and I get this guy coming on, the frequency that they were speaking on, they were split. So that I was listening, the frequency I was listening on, and everybody else was listening on. And what I heard was a continuous moaning in a foreign language, just continuous. So every time the guy would transmit, you would hear, oh, and to me, I go to Jim's article and I think this guy is potentially very seriously mentally ill, or he's drunk. In which case, you can't do anything with either one of those, except use the one big knob. Unfortunately, if you're trying to work at the expedition, using the one big knob is a problem. All right, that's enough on me, guys. I'll pass it back to our leader here.
You know, again, I think the idea today was just to sit back. We oftentimes have, cool presentations in here. We don't stop and reflect on, what we do to others unintentionally or intentionally. And it's brought out in the article, most QRM is unintentional. And I agree with that. And I was one of those unintentional guys during the last DX station, but I can think about that. And so that really was the message that the three of us kind of wanted to leave with you today. You've probably seen this this clip before. It'd be interesting. How many people have seen this clip on YouTube? Not that many. So in the minutes for the meeting, I'll give the link, and this time ops test the link and make sure it really works. Because if nothing else, the more people that see this, as I said, it's as timely today as it was before. Mike, I do have one last question to you. I mentioned earlier the DX code of conduct. Could you take just 2 seconds or so to kind of summarize the code of conduct that we implicitly have signed up to, either within the amateur radios code or well, kind of give us 2 cents worth of what these codes say. We'll make sure that in the minutes we put these 2 codes in the reference list so that you can pull them out.
Okay, well, there is such a thing as the Radio Amateurs Code. You can find it on the ARRL website if you dig. Go to the search and you can find it, Radio Amateurs Code. And the main bullets are considerate, loyal, progressive, friendly, balanced, and patriotic. The only one that I feel is relevant to our discussion tonight is considerate. He, she never knowingly operates in such a way as to lessen the pleasure of others. That's pretty broad. The rest of them are address other qualities that radio amateurs should have, such as progressive. He, she keeps her station up to date. I'm a sad failure there.
I pride myself with old radios.
Yes, I have some great old radio. Anyway, the DX code of conduct. Now, I'm not a DXer, and we should turn this over to Bill, but Mike did ask me. And there are about, looks like about 15 bullets of things that I will or will not do when I am trying to work DX. The one that particularly is relevant to me, to me, the one that's relevant to our discussion tonight is the last one that says, I will respect my fellow hams and conduct myself so as to earn their respect. Well, that's pretty good. That's very general again. And it does apply to these things that we've talked about. The rest of the things are techniques and modes of operating that are relevant to working DX. So I don't think that those 2 codes are really particularly relevant to what we've talked about tonight.
The intentional.
And I'm not really keen on codes telling us what to do and what not to do on the air. Those things that Riley talked about, I thought tonight on his audio clip, were general and easy to follow, I thought, without having to memorize the do's and don'ts that these codes list.
Any thoughts within the crowd? Was this a reasonable kind of stop the train and have this kind of conversation? What do you guys say after all this?
I think a lot of this is common sense and competency. Obviously, these guys will get in and start creating mayhem on someone else's talk. You're mentally ill, They have some kind of issue.
Or drunk.
Yeah.
Or both. Or both.
Well, I'm a pleasant drunk. I'm not like a QRM drunk.
The ones I heard were not that pleasant, but go on. But they were obviously drunk.
There's one thing you can't get away from, and that is the appeal of anonymity behind the mic or the key. I mean, I remember this from the 11-meter days. Those who can't do anything about their misfortunes become wolves if they can belittle someone over the radio, regardless of what frequency it is. And that's always going to be there. You're always going to have those bullies who hide behind their radio, but wouldn't say 2 peeps in a face-to-face confrontation. And again, the thing to do is to spin that big knob.
Yep.
I just wanted to add one other thing that occurred to me while we were talking about this. That is, that Riley talked about a lot more than just QRM, intentional or otherwise. He talked about civility in amateur radio. And what I want to say was, in our society today, not getting into politics, but in our society today, occasionally there is a lack of civility. There's a lot of divisiveness. But we in amateur radio do not have to sink into that. We do not have to sink into that. We can maintain civility. A lot of us here have totally different political views, and we seem to get along really well. I'll help you out with your antenna, even though your views are completely different from mine, because we're having fun with amateur radio. And I want to encourage us all to maintain that level of civility, because we can be a model for society as a whole. By the way, there are over 700,000 licensed amateurs in the U.S. now. Do you know that? Over 700,000. There's going to be a few crazy ones in there.
My elder taught me never talk about sex, politics, or religion on the air. And that'll cut out a lot of problems.
You must have had the same elder.
This is why our internet is so boring.
That just may be a good way to end this. Thanks so much for coming on an Easter weekend holiday. Hopefully everybody has a safe remaining holiday weekend, and go out there and do some QSO. It's a QSO party this weekend is Michigan, my home state.